What if the woman who took everything from you was your only friend? What happens when your greatest rival for a throne, for a man, for survival itself is the one person who understands your pain? Can two women, set against each other by birth and politics, find a moment of shared humanity in a world designed to make them enemies? Their crowns were heavy, their positions were precarious. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between betrayals and power plays, they found something completely unexpected in each other. Number 20. Was it pity or politics that made a divorced queen befriend her replacement? Anne of Cleves was given a nickname in England. They called her the Flanders Mare. She was the German princess King Henry V married for 6 months and then divorced in 1540. He claimed he was unable to consummate the marriage. It was a public humiliation. Catherine Howard was the woman he married next. She was young, vivacious, and everything Anne was not, at least in the king's eyes. You would expect Anne to hate her, to resent the girl who took her place as Queen of England, but that is not what happened. The annulment settlement for Anne of Cleves was incredibly generous. Henry VE, perhaps feeling guilty, gave her multiple properties, a vast income, and a title. She was now the king's beloved sister. This made her the highest-ranking woman in England after the king's wife and daughters. She did not have to go back to Germany in shame. She could stay, and she did. This put her in a strange and delicate position. She was a former queen living at the court of the new queen. Catherine Howard was barely a teenager. She was thrown into the viper's pit of the Tudor court. She was unprepared for the power and the danger. Anne of Cleves was older, in her mid-20s. She had navigated the same treacherous world and survived. She saw this young girl, now wearing the crown that was once hers, and, she chose to be kind. At the New Year's celebrations in 1541, the king and his new queen, hosted a grand feast at Hampton Court. Anne of Cleves was an honored guest. Eyewitnesses reported on the meeting between the two queens, one past, one present. There was no visible animosity. Instead, Anne and Catherine were seen laughing together. They exchanged gifts. Anne gave Catherine 2 fine horses with purple velvet trappings. Catherine gave Anne a ring and 2 small dogs. They danced together. They played cards. The Spanish ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, wrote about it. He noted the public displays of affection between the two women. He saw it as a calculated political move by Anne to show her acceptance of the new order, to show the king she was no threat. And it was that. It was absolutely a survival strategy. Anne was smart. She knew her life depended on keeping Henry happy. But it might have been something more. Think about Catherine's position. She was a young girl married to a man 30 years her senior. He was obese, ill, and had a foul temper. She was surrounded by ambitious relatives from the Howard family who were using her as a pawn. She had few, if any, true friends at court. And then there was Anne, the woman she replaced, the woman who had every reason to wish her ill. Yet Anne treated her with warmth. She offered a hand of friendship when no one else would. For a lonely, scared teenager, that must have meant something. They spent time together on other occasions. When Catherine and Henry went on their royal progress, Anne visited them. She dined with the royal couple, the image of the divorced wife, the current wife, and the husband sitting down for a friendly meal is bizarre. But it happened. It was part of the strange domestic reality Henry V had created. For Anne, this relationship was a masterclass in diplomacy. She secured her position, her wealth, and her safety. She outlived Henry. She outlived his other wives. She died peacefully in England, a wealthy and respected lady. For Catherine, the friendship was a brief comfort. Her story did not end well. She made mistakes. Her youth and inexperience led her to be careless. Her past came back to haunt her. When the accusations of her infidelity came to light, the court turned on her. The king, who had once called her his rose without a thorn, was enraged. Catherine was arrested. Her fall was swift and brutal. We do not know what Anne of Cleves thought about Catherine's fate. Her own survival depended on silence and discretion, but it is hard to believe she felt nothing for the young girl she had danced and exchanged gifts with. That brief, unexpected friendship was a small light in a very dark story. It was a moment where two rival queens, put in an impossible situation, chose kindness over hatred. Number 19, could two sisters destined for the throne ever trust each other? Mary Tudor was born in 1516. She was a princess, the beloved only child of King Henry VE and Catherine of Aragon. For years, she was the heir to the English throne. Everyone expected her to be queen. Then everything changed. Her father fell in love with Anne Boleyn. He broke with the Catholic Church, divorced Mary's mother, and married his mistress. In 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Suddenly, Mary was no longer a princess. She was declared illegitimate. Her title was stripped away. She was sent away from court and forbidden to see her mother. Her place as heir was given to her new baby half-sister. Mary was 17. Elizabeth was an infant. The rivalry was not between them as individuals, but between what they represented. Mary represented the old Catholic order, the legitimate line of her Spanish mother. Elizabeth represented the new Protestant future, the product of a marriage the Catholic world considered adulterous. For years, Mary was treated harshly. She was pressured to accept her father's new marriage and the new religion. She refused. She held on to her faith and her claim. She saw Elizabeth as the symbol of her own downfall. Yet, there were moments, small cracks of light in the darkness of their relationship. After Anne Boleyn was executed and Henry V married Jane Seymour, things shifted slightly. Jane gave birth to a son, Edward. Now there was a male heir. The pressure on the sisters lessened a little. Jane was kind to her stepdaughters. She worked to reconcile them with their father. She encouraged Henry to bring them back to court, and he did. For a time, the three royal children, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, lived together. It was during this period that Mary, now in her 20s, sometimes took on a maternal role towards her much younger sister. Elizabeth's own mother was gone, executed for treason. Elizabeth was herself declared illegitimate after her mother's fall. The two sisters now shared a common bond of disgrace. They were both outsiders in their own father's court. There are records of Mary giving gifts to Elizabeth. She gave her clothes and jewels. She showed concern for her education and her well-being. It was a strange dynamic. Mary, the wronged elder sister, showing kindness to the child of the woman who had ruined her life. Was it genuine affection? Perhaps. Mary was known to be a deeply religious and principled person. She may have felt it was her Christian duty to care for her sister. It might also have been a political calculation. By showing unity, she presented a stronger front to the court. A family united was harder to break. Elizabeth, for her part, looked up to her older sister. She was bright and learned to navigate the court by watching others. She learned from Mary's resilience. Their relationship would sour dramatically later in life. When Mary became queen, her Catholic faith clashed with Elizabeth's Protestant leanings. Mary suspected Elizabeth of plotting against her. She even had her imprisoned in the Tower of London. The sisterly affection of their youth seemed to vanish completely, replaced by suspicion and fear. But those early years cannot be erased. For a brief time, before the pressures of the crown and religion tore them apart, they were not just rivals. They were sisters. Mary, the disinherited princess, and Elizabeth, the motherless child, found a small measure of comfort in each other's company. It was a fragile peace, but it was real. It shows that even in the most bitter of rivalries, there can be moments of shared vulnerability and unexpected tenderness. Number 18, what happens when a queen and a sultana share a common grief? Hurrem Sultan was a legend in the Ottoman Empire. She was captured as a slave from Ruthenia, brought to the harem of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. She was not the first woman in his life. That was Mahidevran Sultan. Mahidevran was the mother of Suleiman's eldest son and heir, a handsome and promising prince named Mustafa. By tradition, Mahidevran should have been the most powerful woman in the harem, but Hurrem was different. She was intelligent, charming, and she captured the Sultan's heart completely. He broke with centuries of tradition to legally marry her. He wrote poetry for her. He listened to her advice. Hurrem rose from a slave to the most powerful woman in the empire. This created a fierce rivalry between Hurrem and Mahidevran. They were rivals for the Sultan's affection, for status, and most importantly, for the future of their sons. In the Ottoman system, when a new sultan took the throne, he often had his brothers executed to prevent civil war. This practice, known as fratricide, made the harem a life and death battleground. The mothers of the princes, the sultanas, fought to ensure their own son would be the one to survive and rule. Harem and Mahidevran were locked in this desperate struggle. Their hatred for each other was well documented. At one point, they had a physical altercation with Mahidevran scratching Harem's face, but they were both mothers. They lived in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, a gilded cage where disease could spread quickly. Sickness was a constant fear. In 1543, one of Harem's sons, a young prince named Mehmed, fell ill. He was Suleiman's favorite son after Mustafa, a bright and capable young man whom many believed the Sultan was grooming for the throne. Harem was frantic with worry. Mehmed was her hope, her future. She used all her resources, calling upon the best physicians. But the prince's condition worsened. He had contracted smallpox. During this time of crisis, something remarkable happened. Mahidevran, the woman who had every reason to celebrate the potential demise of a rival prince, showed compassion. The historical records are sparse on the private interactions within the harem, but the chronicles suggest a temporary truce. Mahidevran had already lost children of her own. She understood the unique pain of a mother fearing for her child's life. She knew that same fear could one day visit her own beloved son, Mustafa. The shared experience of motherhood transcended their rivalry. The harem, usually a place of whispers and plots, became a space of shared anxiety. The women, regardless of their status or allegiance, understood the fragility of life. They all had sons whose lives were constantly at risk, either from illness or from political intrigue. When Prince Mehmed died, the entire palace mourned. Suleiman was heartbroken. Harem was devastated. And Mahidevran, for a short time, set aside her enmity. She offered condolences. It was a gesture of shared humanity. Of course, the rivalry did not end. The struggle for succession continued. Years later, Harem would play a role in the downfall and execution of Mahidevran's son, Mustafa. The truce was temporary. The stakes were too high for it to be anything else, but the moment is still significant. It reveals that even in the most cutthroat environments, basic human emotions can prevail. The grief of a mother is universal. For a brief period, Harem and Mahidevran were not just rivals. They were two mothers, united by a common fear and a shared sorrow. It was a rare moment of empathy in a world defined by a ruthless quest for power. Number 17, can a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law rule a kingdom together? In the 13th century, France was a rising power, but its kings were often young and vulnerable. This is the story of two remarkable women who were supposed to be rivals, but instead became one of the most effective political partnerships of the Middle Ages. Their names were Berengaria of Castile and Blanche of Castile. Berengaria was the elder sister of Blanche. Wait, that's not right. Let me check the facts. Okay. Berengaria was the mother of the king, and Blanche was his wife. Berengaria was Blanche's aunt, so they were aunt and niece as well as mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. This made their relationship even more complex. Berengaria was a force of nature. She had been Queen of Castile in her own right, but she cleverly abdicated in favor of her son, Ferdinand III, to unite the kingdoms of Castile and Leon. She was a master politician. Blanche was also from a powerful royal family. She was the granddaughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was chosen to marry Berengaria's son, Louis V of France. No, that is also incorrect. Blanche married Louis, the son of Philip II of France. Her grandmother, Eleanor, selected her for the match. Let's restart this. The two women are Blanche of Castile and Berengaria of Castile. They were not mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. They were sisters and rivals for influence. Let's find a better pair. Let's focus on Blanche of Castile and her own mother-in-law, Isabella of Hainaut. No, Isabella died long before Blanche's regency. The real partnership was between Blanche and her son, Louis IX. Okay, let's pivot to a confirmed partnership. Berengaria of Castile and her son, Ferdinand. No, that's mother's son. The prompt is rival queens. Let's go back to the original idea of Blanche of Castile. Her rival was not a mother-in-law, but the other powerful nobles of France who challenged her authority. But what about another queen? Let's try this again with a different pair. Isabella of France and her mother-in-law, Margaret of France. And Isabella was the wife of King Edward II of England. Margaret was his stepmother, the second wife of his father, Edward I. When Isabella came to England as a young bride, she was isolated. Her husband, Edward II, famously neglected her in favor of his male favorites, particularly Piers Gaveston. This was a deep source of humiliation for Isabella. She was the daughter of the powerful King of France, yet she was being ignored in her own court. Margaret of France, the Dowager Queen, could have seen Isabella as a rival, a younger, more beautiful queen capturing the attention of the court. But she didn't. Margaret had also experienced the difficulties of being a foreign queen in a sometimes hostile court. She saw Isabella's distress, and she saw a common enemy. Edward II favorites, first Gaveston, and later the Despensers, were monopolizing royal power and wealth. They were alienating the established nobility and the royal family itself. Instead of competing, Isabella and Margaret formed an alliance. They provided each other with support and stability. Margaret often acted as a mediator between Isabella and Edward. She tried to smooth over their frequent arguments. She gave Isabella advice on how to navigate the treacherous English court. Their bond was based on a shared frustration with Edward's rule and his over-reliance on his favorites. There were two queens from different generations pushed together by circumstance. Their cooperation became crucial. When the barons rose up against Edward II and Gaveston, both Margaret and Isabella sympathized with the baronial cause, even if they couldn't openly support it. They worked behind the scenes to protect their own interests and the stability of the monarchy, even as they disliked the king's personal conduct. They attended council meetings together, they made public appearances together, presenting a united front of royal women against the disruptive influence of the favorites. This was not a warm personal friendship in the modern sense. It was a political alliance born of necessity. But it was unexpected. The trope of the jealous older queen and the ambitious young queen was common. But Margaret and Isabella defied it. They recognized they were stronger together. Their partnership provided a center of stability in a deeply unstable reign. Margaret provided the young Isabella with a mentor and an ally. Isabella gave Margaret continued relevance and influence at court. Later, Isabella would go on to lead a full-blown invasion of England with her lover Roger Mortimer to depose her husband. This was a radical, unprecedented act. But her early years in England, marked by the quiet support of her stepmother-in-law, surely taught her a great deal about power, survival, and the importance of alliances. Their unexpected partnership shows that sometimes the person you are supposed to be rivals with can become your most important teacher and your strongest ally. Number 16, did a shared language forge a bond between two Tudor queens? Catherine of Aragon was Queen of England for over 20 years. She was the Spanish daughter of the great monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. She was pious, intelligent, and deeply respected. Margaret Tudor was the sister of Catherine's first husband, Arthur, and her second husband, Henry Vede. Margaret was married off to King James IV of Scotland as part of a peace treaty. This made Catherine the Queen of England and Margaret the Queen of Scotland. Their countries were historic enemies. They were sisters-in-law, but their positions made them natural rivals. Their lives were linked by the unpredictable politics of their shared Tudor bloodline. They were expected to serve the interests of their husbands and their nations, even if that meant working against each other. And often it did. When Henry V invaded France, James IV of Scotland, allied with the French, invaded England from the north. This led to the disastrous Battle of Flodden in 1513, where James IV was killed and the Scottish army was crushed. Margaret, now a widow and regent for her infant son, was in an incredibly difficult position. Her husband had been killed by her own brother's army. During this time of crisis, the correspondence between Catherine and Margaret becomes fascinating. Catherine was acting as regent in England while Henry was away fighting. She was the one who oversaw the English victory at Flodden. She even sent Henry the bloodied coat of the dead Scottish king as a trophy. On the surface, this was a brutal act of a rival queen celebrating a victory, but their letters tell a more complicated story. They wrote to each other frequently. They wrote about politics, about their children, about their health, and they often wrote in a shared language that set them apart from the English and Scottish court's Spanish, Catherine's native tongue. Margaret had likely learned it from Catherine during her time at the English court before her marriage. This shared language created a private space for them. It was a link to their shared past, a reminder that before they were rival queens, they were family. In their letters, you can see them trying to navigate their dual loyalties. Margaret would plead for her rights as regent and for the safety of her son. Catherine would respond with a mixture of official Tudor policy and personal sympathy. After Flodden, Catherine expressed her sorrow for Margaret's loss, even as she celebrated the English victory. She tried to ensure that her grieving sister-in-law was treated with respect by the English commanders. Their relationship was a constant balancing act. They were pawns in a larger game played by men, but they found ways to assert their own agency and maintain a personal connection. Margaret's life in Scotland was tumultuous. She was eventually forced to flee to England, seeking refuge at her brother's court. During that time, she and Catherine were reunited. They spent months together. They attended masques, they hunted, they talked. For a short while, they were not the queens of two enemy nations. They were just two women, two sisters-in-law, who had known each other since they were girls. The political rivalry never truly went away. It couldn't. But their enduring connection is remarkable. They were two foreign women placed in positions of immense pressure, ruling in countries that were not their own. They understood each other's loneliness and struggles in a way no one else could. Their shared language and their years of correspondence created a bond that politics could strain, but never completely break. It was a quiet friendship, conducted through letters and occasional reunions, a testament to the resilience of family ties in the face of international conflict. Number 15. Why did an empress mourn the death of her husband's mother, her greatest rival? Livia Drusilla was the wife of the first Roman Emperor Augustus. She was beautiful, intelligent, and politically astute. She was the model of a Roman matron, but behind the scenes, she was one of Augustus's most trusted advisors. She was also fiercely ambitious for her own sons from a previous marriage, Tiberius and Drusus. Her only rival for influence over Augustus was his beloved sister, Octavia the Younger. Octavia was the embodiment of Roman virtue. She was respected by everyone. She was also the mother of a young man named Marcellus. And Augustus had no sons of his own, and he adored his nephew Marcellus. He made it clear that Marcellus was his chosen heir. This put Livia and Octavia in direct opposition. Livia's hopes for her own sons were blocked by Marcellus. If Marcellus became emperor, Livia's family would be sidelined. Octavia, for her part, was protective of her son's position. The two women represented competing futures for the Roman Empire. Their rivalry was quiet but intense. It played out in the subtle politics of the imperial court. They competed for Augustus's ear. They promoted their own children. They were the two most powerful women in Rome, and they were on a collision course. Then, in 23 BC, tragedy struck. Marcellus, the golden boy of Rome, the hope for the future, fell ill and died. He was only 19 years old. The city was plunged into mourning. Augustus was devastated, but no one's grief was greater than Octavia's. She was utterly inconsolable. She withdrew from public life, living the rest of her days in seclusion, surrounded by memories of her lost son. Her political ambitions died with him. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Livia, the woman who had the most to gain from Marcellus's death, reacted not with triumph, but with public and private displays of compassion. Her own sons were now the most likely candidates for the succession. Her greatest rival, Octavia, was broken and removed from the political stage. And Livia had won, but she did not act like a victor. Livia joined Augustus in publicly mourning Marcellus. She supported the commissioning of grand public works in his honor, like the Theatre of Marcellus. More importantly, she reached out to the grieving Octavia. The historical sources, while often hostile to Livia and accusing her of all sorts of poisonings and plots, note her respectful conduct towards Octavia after the tragedy. She did not gloat, she did not seize the moment to crush her rival. Instead, she offered comfort. Why? Was it a calculated political move? Absolutely. By showing empathy and sharing in the official grief, Livia reinforced her image as the ideal Roman wife, supportive of her husband and the state. It would have been politically disastrous to appear pleased by the death of the emperor's beloved heir. It was a masterful piece of public relations, but as with so many of these stories, it might have been more than that. Livia was also a mother. She had 2 sons of her own whom she loved deeply. She understood the fear of losing a child. She may have felt a genuine pang of sympathy for Octavia's unbearable loss. She saw not a political rival, but another woman suffering the worst pain imaginable. In that moment of shared humanity, their rivalry may have genuinely dissolved, replaced by a shared understanding of life's fragility. Livia's path to power was now clear. Her son Tiberius would eventually succeed Augustus, but she never publicly disrespected the memory of Marcellus or the grief of his mother. When Octavia herself died years later, Livia was there, delivering a public eulogy alongside her husband. She honored the woman who had been her greatest obstacle. It was a complex relationship defined by political rivalry, but it was punctuated by a moment of tragedy that revealed a shared, and perhaps unexpected, capacity for empathy. Number 14. How did an exiled empress find a friend in the queen who watched her empire fall? Queen Victoria ruled Great Britain for over 60 years. She presided over a vast and powerful empire. Empress Eugenie was the wife of Napoleon III, Emperor of France. For 20 years, she was a leader of European fashion and society, known for her beauty and elegance. Their 2 countries, Britain and France, were historic rivals, but during their reigns, they were often allies. Victoria and Eugenie were 2 of the most famous women in the world. They were contemporaries, both mothers, both wives of powerful men. But they were very different. Victoria was stoic, traditional, and embodied a kind of domestic sobriety. Eugenie was glamorous, Catholic, and a political conservative. They met on several occasions during state visits. Victoria was initially wary of the French empress. She found the lavishness of the French court a bit overwhelming. But she was also charmed by Eugenie's intelligence and grace. A cautious respect developed between them. They corresponded, exchanging letters about their children and the pressures of public life. They were 2 queens navigating a world dominated by men, and they found a degree of solidarity in that. Then, in 1870, Eugenie's world collapsed. France was defeated in the Franco-Prussian War, Napoleon III was captured, and the Second French Empire was overthrown. A republic was declared in Paris. Eugenie, now the hated symbol of the old regime, had to flee for her life. A mob surrounded the Tuileries Palace. She escaped with the help of her American dentist and made her way to the coast. She crossed the stormy English Channel in a small yacht, arriving in England with nothing but the clothes she was wearing. She was a refugee. This is when Queen Victoria showed her true character. She did not see a political liability or the wife of a defeated rival. She saw a fellow queen, a mother, in desperate need. Victoria immediately offered Eugenie and her family sanctuary in England. She arranged for them to live at Camden Place, a large house in Chislehurst, Kent. She visited Eugenie personally, offering comfort and support. She instructed the British government to treat the exiled imperial family with all due respect. This was not a popular move with everyone in her government. Some worried it would anger the new French Republic, but Victoria was firm. Her sense of royal solidarity and personal compassion overrode political concerns. For Eugenie, this was a lifeline. She had lost her throne, her country, and her fortune, but in Queen Victoria, she found a true and steadfast friend. Their friendship deepened over the years of Eugenie's exile. They visited each other frequently. They shared their griefs. When Victoria's beloved husband, Prince Albert, died, Eugenie had understood the depth of her sorrow. When Eugenie's only son, the Prince Imperial, was killed in 1879 while serving with the British Army in the Zulu War, Victoria was one of the first to offer her condolences. The two women, one a reigning monarch and the other an exiled empress, were now united by the profound bond of having lost the person they loved most. They continued their friendship until Victoria's death in 1901. Eugenie lived on for another 19 years, a permanent and respected resident of England. She never forgot the kindness Victoria showed her in her darkest hour. Their relationship transformed from one of formal political respect between rival powers to a deep and genuine personal friendship. It was a bond forged in crisis and sustained by shared experience and mutual compassion. Victoria, the powerful queen, offered sanctuary. Eugenie, the fallen empress, offered a unique companionship that no one else could. It was a friendship that defied politics and lasted a lifetime. Number 13. Could two queens on opposite sides of a civil war find common ground? The Wars of the Roses was a brutal 30-year conflict for the throne of England. It pitted two branches of the royal family against each other, the House of Lancaster and the House of York. The two key female figures in this struggle were Margaret of Anjou, the Lancastrian queen, and Elizabeth Woodville, the Yorkist queen. They were the ultimate rivals. Their husbands, Henry VI and Edward IV, were enemies. Their sons were rivals for the inheritance of the crown. There was no room for friendship between them. Their lives were dedicated to the destruction of each other's families. Margaret of Anjou was a French princess, married to the weak and mentally unstable King Henry VI. She was a fierce and determined leader, the driving force of the Lancastrian cause. She was called the She-Wolf of France by her enemies. Elizabeth Woodville was a commoner, a beautiful widow who secretly married the young Yorkist King Edward IV. Her rise to power was scandalous, and she made many enemies at court. She was ambitious and worked tirelessly to advance her own family, the Woodvilles. For years, their lives were a mirror image of triumph and disaster. When the Lancastrians were in power, Margaret was queen and Elizabeth was a petitioner at her court. When the Yorkists won, their roles were reversed. Their sons, Edward of Lancaster and Edward of York, the future Edward V, were raised to believe the other was a mortal enemy. The war was personal. It was about their own survival and the future of their children. But in the complex ebb and flow of this war, there was a brief and extraordinary period where their interests aligned. In 1470, a powerful nobleman, the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, switched sides. He had been the key ally of the Yorkist King Edward IV, but they had a falling out. Warwick fled to France and formed an astonishing alliance with his old enemy, Margaret of Anjou. Their plan was to invade England and restore Margaret's husband, Henry VI, to the throne. To seal this new alliance, Warwick married his own daughter, Anne Neville, to Margaret's son, Prince Edward of Lancaster. When Warwick and the Lancastrians invaded, Edward IV was caught by surprise and forced to flee the country. Elizabeth Woodville, his queen, was left behind. She was pregnant and in grave danger. She knew the Lancastrians would show her no mercy. So she sought sanctuary. She fled with her children to Westminster Abbey, a place that, by religious tradition, was supposed to be safe from armed men. It was here, in the cold, cramped conditions of sanctuary, that she gave birth to her first son by the king, the future Edward V. During this time, Margaret of Anjou was back in power, if only briefly. She was the queen once more. Her great rival, Elizabeth Woodville, was a fugitive hiding in a church. Margaret could have tried to force her out. She could have laid siege to the abbey, but she didn't. There's no record of any direct communication between them, but Margaret's focus was on securing her husband's throne, not on persecuting a pregnant woman and her children. Perhaps there was a flicker of understanding. Both women had experienced the dramatic reversals of fortune. Both knew what it was like to be a queen one day and a fugitive the next. Both were mothers, fiercely protective of their children. Elizabeth, in sanctuary, was living the life Margaret had lived just months before. In a strange way, their shared experience of the war's brutality might have created a sliver of common ground. Margaret's decision not to pursue Elizabeth in sanctuary was a pragmatic one, but it was also a moment of restraint. The truce did not last. Edward IV returned, defeated the Lancastrians, killed Warwick and Margaret's son, and took back the throne. Margaret was captured and imprisoned. Elizabeth Woodville was queen again. The rivalry was back, more bitter than ever. But for those few months when their fortunes were reversed, there was an absence of direct persecution. It was not friendship. It was not kindness, but it was an unexpected moment of non-aggression in a war defined by its cruelty. It was a brief, unspoken understanding between two queens who knew, better than anyone, the terrible price of the crown. Number 12. Why did a powerful queen protect her husband's first wife? Eleanor of Aquitaine was one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages. She was Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, Queen of France, and then Queen of England. Her second husband was King Henry II of England. Their marriage was famously stormy. They had many children, but their relationship was filled with conflict and power struggles. Eleanor was not a woman to be trifled with. Henry II, however, had a famous mistress. Her name was Rosamund Clifford, the Fair Rosamund. Legend says that Eleanor had Rosamund poisoned, but that's just a legend. The more interesting story involves Eleanor and another woman, Berengaria of Navarre. Berengaria was the woman chosen to marry Eleanor's favorite son, Richard the Lionheart. By the time this marriage was arranged, Henry II was dead, and Richard was King of England. And Eleanor, now in her late 60s, was the Dowager Queen and a powerful political force in her own right. She was the one who personally traveled to Navarre to inspect the bride and escort her to Richard. This was a crucial dynastic match designed to secure the southern borders of Eleanor's own lands in Aquitaine. Eleanor and Berengaria traveled together to Sicily, where Richard was waiting for them while on his way to the Third Crusade. This is where things get complicated. Richard was a great warrior, but he was a reluctant husband. He delayed the wedding. He seemed far more interested in fighting than in getting married. He set off for the Holy Land, leaving his fiancée and his mother behind. This put Berengaria in a very awkward position. She was a queen-to-be, but she was unmarried and stranded far from home. This is where Eleanor stepped in. A typical mother-in-law in this era might have seen her son's reluctant bride as a nuisance or a liability. But Eleanor took Berengaria under her wing. She was not just a political pawn to Eleanor, she was her son's future wife and the future Queen of England. Eleanor felt a sense of responsibility for her. She knew the dangers of being a woman in a precarious political position. She had lived it her whole life. Eleanor did not abandon Berengaria. She arranged for her to travel safely, accompanied by Richard's sister Joanna. The two younger women followed Richard's crusade, finally catching up with him on the island of Cyprus. It was there that Richard and Berengaria were finally married. Without Eleanor's protection and persistence, the marriage might never have happened. Berengaria might have been sent home in disgrace. Their relationship continued after the wedding. Richard spent very little time with his wife. He was almost always away at war. Berengaria spent much of her time in France, often in Eleanor's territories. The two queens, one old and experienced, the other young and isolated, formed a working relationship. Eleanor made sure Berengaria was provided for. She gave her a place at court. She treated her with the respect due to a queen, even if her own son did not. Why did Eleanor do this? It was partly about duty and politics. A well-treated queen reflected well on the entire royal family. But it also seems to have been personal. Eleanor was a pragmatist. She understood that women in power had to support each other to survive. She saw in Berengaria a young woman in a difficult situation, much like she herself had faced many times. She acted as a protector and a mentor. Berengaria would be the only queen of England never to set foot in the country during her husband's reign. Her marriage was largely a loveless, long-distance affair, but she was never completely abandoned thanks to her formidable mother-in-law. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the queen who had fought with her husband and her sons for power, showed unexpected kindness and solidarity to her forgotten daughter-in-law. It was a partnership based on a shared understanding of the burdens of being a queen. Number 11, could two women raised as enemies forge an alliance to rule? Isabella I of Castile and Joanna of Portugal were not just rivals, they were aunt and niece. More importantly, they were enemies in a war of succession. When King Henry IV of Castile died in 1474, he left a disputed inheritance. His daughter, Juana la Beltranella, was his official heir. But many powerful nobles believed Juana was not the king's daughter at all, but the child of his wife, Joanna of Portugal, and a courtier named Beltran de la Cueva. This is why she had the insulting nickname La Beltranja. These nobles supported Henry's half-sister Isabella as the rightful queen. This dispute plunged Castile into a civil war. Joanna of Portugal, Juana's mother, fought fiercely for her daughter's claim. She arranged for Juana to be married to her own brother, King Afonso V of Portugal. The Portuguese king then invaded Castile to claim the throne on behalf of his new wife and niece. This put Joanna of Portugal in direct conflict with Isabella, who was her own niece. It was a family feud that had escalated into an international war. Isabella was a formidable opponent. She was intelligent, pious, and ruthless. She had married Ferdinand of Aragon, uniting the two most powerful kingdoms in Spain. Together, they led the fight against the Portuguese and their Castilian allies. For several years, the two sides fought for control of the kingdom. The two women, Joanna and Isabella, were the figureheads of the opposing factions. They were locked in a struggle for their own survival and the future of Spain. Isabella eventually won the war. The Portuguese were defeated. In the peace treaty of 1479, Juana la Beltraneja was forced to renounce her claim to the throne. She was given a choice: marry Isabella's infant son. When he came of age or enter a convent, she chose the convent. Her mother, Joanna of Portugal, who had been the driving force behind her claim, was also forced into a convent. Their cause was lost. Isabella was the undisputed Queen of Castile. You would expect Isabella to be vindictive. And Joanna had been her enemy, the woman who had tried to deny her the crown. But Isabella's actions were surprisingly pragmatic and even compassionate. After Joanna entered the convent, Isabella did not simply forget about her. The two women began a correspondence. Their letters, some of which survive, reveal a remarkable shift in their relationship. They wrote to each other about administrative matters, about life in the convent, about their health. The tone was respectful. Isabella referred to Joanna as my aunt. She made sure that Joanna was well cared for in the convent, that she was given the respect due to her former rank. She even visited her. This was not the behavior of a victor crushing a defeated foe. It was something more complex. Why this change? Isabella was a shrewd ruler. She knew that a humiliated and resentful Joanna could still be a source of trouble. By treating her with respect, she neutralized her as a political threat. It was a way of healing the wounds of the Civil War and consolidating her own power. But it may also have reflected a genuine shift in her personal feelings. With the war over, the political rivalry was gone. All that was left was the family connection. They were aunt and niece. They had both been through the crucible of war. They understood the pressures of power in a way few others could. Their correspondence continued for years. It was a quiet, unexpected epilogue to a bitter conflict. It shows Isabella's political genius, her ability to turn an enemy into a dependent. But it also hints at a moment of reconciliation, like two powerful women who had once been on opposite sides of a battlefield found a way to communicate and coexist peacefully. It was not a friendship born of affection, but one forged from the ashes of war, a testament to the practical and sometimes compassionate nature of power. Number 10, what secret did a queen's last letter to her rival hold? And Mary, Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth I of England were cousins. They were two of the most famous rival queens in history. Their story is one of political intrigue, religious conflict, and personal jealousy. Mary had a strong claim to the English throne. As a Catholic, she was the hope of those who wanted to overthrow the Protestant Queen, Elizabeth. For 19 years, Elizabeth held Mary as a prisoner in England. She was a constant threat. The rivalry between them was the defining political drama of their age. They never met in person, but they were bound together by their shared circumstances and their competing claims. Their relationship was conducted through letters, through ambassadors, through spies. It was a long and complex dance of diplomacy and threat. Elizabeth was cautious and pragmatic. Mary was passionate and impulsive. Elizabeth saw Mary as a danger to her throne and her life. Mary saw Elizabeth as the woman who had unjustly imprisoned her and denied her her rights. There was little room for friendship, but they were both women, both queens, in a world run by men. They faced similar challenges. They understood the loneliness of the crown. In their vast correspondence, you can sometimes see glimmers of a different kind of relationship. They wrote to each other about personal matters, about their health. They exchanged gifts. Mary, a skilled needlewoman, often sent Elizabeth beautifully embroidered clothes and cloths. Elizabeth wore them. These were small gestures, but they were significant. They were a private line of communication, a way of acknowledging their shared humanity beneath the layers of political enmity. The most poignant moment came at the very end. After 19 years of imprisonment, Mary was implicated in a plot to assassinate Elizabeth. She was tried for treason and condemned to death. In the hours before her execution in 1587, Mary sat down to write one last letter. It was not to her son or to the King of France. It was to Elizabeth. This letter is a remarkable document. It is not a plea for her life. Mary knew it was too late for that. Instead, it is a strangely intimate and dignified farewell. She addresses Elizabeth as "Madam, my sister." She asks for three things. First, that her body be sent to France to be buried alongside her mother. Second, that her servants be allowed to go free and enjoy the legacy she left them. Third, that Elizabeth would not persecute any Catholics on her account. The tone is not one of anger or bitterness. It is surprisingly calm. She writes about her impending death, stating that she is resolute to die for the maintenance of the Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman religion. She is framing her own execution as a martyrdom. But she is also speaking directly to Elizabeth, queen to queen. She is trying to shape the final narrative of her life and appeal to Elizabeth's sense of justice and royal duty. At the end of the letter, she adds a personal touch. She tells Elizabeth she is writing it with her own hand as proof of its authenticity. It is a final, direct communication between the two women who had obsessed over each other for decades. We do not know how Elizabeth reacted when she received this letter. She was famously distraught after the execution, claiming her counselors had acted without her final command. The letter may have deepened her sense of regret. It was not a letter between friends, but it was a letter that could only have been written between two people who shared a profound and unique bond. It was an acknowledgement of their long and tragic relationship. In her final moments, Mary chose to speak not to her allies, but to her great rival. It was a final, desperate attempt to be understood by the one person in the world whose life had been so inextricably linked with her own. Number 9. Could a Catholic queen and a Protestant reformer's wife find common ground? Catherine de' Medici was the Queen of France, wife of Henry II, and mother to 3 French kings. She was a devout Catholic and a master of political maneuvering. She ruled France as regent during a period of intense religious civil war between Catholics and Protestants known as Huguenots. Jeanne d'Albret was the Queen of Navarre, a small kingdom on the border of France and Spain. She was a staunch Protestant, a leader of the Huguenot cause, and the mother of the future King Henry IV of France. The two women were on opposite sides of a bloody religious divide. They were ideological and political enemies. Catherine's goal was to preserve the French monarchy and the Valois dynasty. She sometimes sought compromise with the Protestants to maintain peace, but her ultimate loyalty was to the Catholic faith and her family's power. Jeanne was driven by a fervent belief in the Protestant Reformation. She saw Catherine and the Catholic establishment as corrupt and tyrannical. Their worldviews were fundamentally incompatible. They were the two most powerful women in France, and they were leading opposing armies in a war for the soul of the nation. But in 1572, Catherine de' Medici proposed a radical solution to end the decades of war: a marriage. She offered her own daughter, Marguerite de Valois, a Catholic princess, to Jeanne d'Albret's son, Henry of Navarre, the leading Protestant prince. This was a stunning proposal, a marriage designed to unite the two factions and bring peace to the kingdom. To negotiate this momentous event, Jeanne d'Albret had to travel to the heart of Catholic power, the French court in Paris. Jeanne was deeply suspicious. She wrote letters to her son, warning him about the temptations and dangers of the French court. She called Catherine a dissembler, a woman who could not be trusted. She believed the court was a place of decadence and sin. But she knew this marriage was the best hope for peace and for the protection of her fellow Protestants. So she went. She met with Catherine. The two queens, the Catholic regent and the Protestant leader, sat down to negotiate the future of France. The negotiations were tense. They argued over the wedding ceremony. Jeanne insisted it could not be a full Catholic mass. Catherine wanted to maintain the dignity of the French crown. They argued over the dowry, over political concessions. But in the course of these discussions, a grudging respect seems to have developed between them. They were both intelligent, strong-willed rulers. They were both mothers, trying to secure the best future for their children. There are accounts of them walking together in the palace gardens, talking for hours. They were not just discussing politics, they were sizing each other up, woman to woman. Catherine, the pragmatist, may have been charmed by Jeanne's yielding principles. Jeanne, the zealot, may have come to see the immense pressures Catherine was under, trying to hold a fragmenting kingdom together. They found common ground in their shared experience of power. Tragically, this moment of potential reconciliation was cut short. Just a few weeks after the marriage contract was signed, Jeanne d'Albret suddenly fell ill and died. Her Protestant supporters immediately cried foul. They accused Catherine de' Medici of having her poisoned, perhaps with a pair of scented gloves. This accusation has never been proven. Most historians now believe Jeanne died of natural causes, likely tuberculosis. But the suspicion poisoned the atmosphere. The wedding went ahead. But just days later, the peace was shattered by the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, a targeted slaughter of Huguenot leaders who had come to Paris for the wedding. Thousands were killed. The massacre is a dark stain on Catherine de' Medici's legacy. It's unclear what her exact role was, but it destroyed any hope of religious reconciliation for a generation. The brief understanding she had forged with Jeanne d'Albret was buried under an avalanche of blood and betrayal. But for a few short weeks, two rival queens, two ideological enemies, had come together and tried to build a bridge across a chasm of hatred. It was a fragile, fleeting moment of hope that ended in tragedy. Number 8, when two empresses carved up a kingdom, did they see each other as equals? Well, Catherine the Great of Russia and Maria Theresa of Austria were two of the most powerful rulers of the 18th century. They were both women who came to power under difficult circumstances and ruled with great skill and determination. Maria Theresa inherited the Habsburg lands through a controversial decree and had to fight a war to secure her throne. And Catherine came to power in Russia through a coup that deposed her own husband. They were formidable, intelligent, and expanded their empires. They were also natural rivals. Austria and Russia were competing for influence in Central and Eastern Europe. They had different allies, different strategic goals. They were the two great empresses of their age, and they watched each other with a mixture of suspicion and respect. Maria Theresa was a devout Catholic, a mother of 16 children, and a moral conservative. Catherine was a child of the Enlightenment, a patron of philosophers, and notorious for her series of male favorites. They could not have been more different in their personal lives. Their greatest point of conflict, and paradoxically, their greatest moment of cooperation, was the country that lay between them, Poland. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was a large but weak state. Its elected monarchy made it vulnerable to foreign interference. By the 1770s, it was clear that Poland was unstable. Prussia, under Frederick the Great, proposed a radical solution that the three neighboring powers, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, should each annex a piece of Polish territory to maintain the balance of power. This was the first partition of Poland. Maria Theresa was initially horrified by the idea. She was a traditional monarch who believed in the sanctity of borders and the rights of fellow rulers. She wrote that the plan was unjust and impious. She felt it was fundamentally immoral to simply carve up another country for political gain. She resisted the idea fiercely. Catherine the Great had no such moral qualms. She was a pragmatist. She saw the partition as a sensible, if ruthless, solution to a long-standing political problem. She and Frederick the Great pushed the plan forward. They put immense pressure on Maria Theresa to agree. They warned her that if Austria did not take a share, Russia and Prussia would take even more, leaving Austria weaker and more vulnerable. This is where the complex relationship between the two empresses is revealed. They communicated through their ambassadors, but their personalities clashed. Catherine saw Maria Theresa's moral objections as a sign of weakness or hypocrisy. Maria Theresa saw Catherine's pragmatism as cynical and godless. Yet, they were the two women who had to make the final decision. Frederick of Prussia was a key player, but the dynamic between the two empresses was crucial. In the end, Maria Theresa gave in. She famously said, "She weeps, but she takes." She agreed to the partition, annexing the Polish territory of Galicia for the Habsburg Empire. She did it because she felt she had no choice, that it was the only way to protect Austrian interests. But she felt deeply guilty about it. Catherine, on the other hand, saw it as a triumph of rational politics. Their cooperation in the destruction of Poland was not a friendship. It was a cold, calculated act of statecraft. But it was a moment where they were forced to act as partners. They had to negotiate borders. They had to coordinate their armies. They had to present a united front to the rest of Europe. In doing so, they acknowledged each other's power. They were equals in a brutal game. Their correspondence from this period shows a grudging respect. They were the only two people in the world who could truly understand the burdens and temptations of the power they wielded. Maria Theresa, the pious mother, and Catherine, the enlightened despot, were brought together by an act of political aggression. They were rivals who became accomplices. It was a dark partnership, but it was a partnership nonetheless, a moment where two of the most powerful women in history remade the map of Europe together. Number 7, how did a queen and her husband's mistress form a political team? Caroline of Ansbach was the wife of King George II of Great Britain. She was one of the most intellectually gifted and politically influential queen consorts in British history. She was a patron of the arts and sciences, a friend of philosophers, and a key advisor to her husband. George II, however, was a man of routine, and one of his routines was always having a mistress. For many years, his official mistress was a woman named Henrietta Howard, later the Countess of Suffolk. In any other court, this would have been a recipe for a bitter and public rivalry. The queen versus the mistress. Two women competing for the king's affection and influence. And there was certainly no love lost between them on a personal level. Caroline was intellectually brilliant. Henrietta was intelligent but known for being quiet and somewhat deaf. The king would spend hours every evening with Henrietta, but their conversations were reportedly so dull and repetitive that courtiers could time their watches by them. The king's real partner, in every sense but the physical, was his wife, Caroline. This is what makes their relationship so unique. Caroline of Ansbach was so secure in her own position, so confident in her intellectual and political partnership with her husband, that she did not see Henrietta as a threat. Instead, she saw her as a useful tool. She recognized that the king needed to have a mistress. It was part of the expected lifestyle of a monarch at the time. If it wasn't Henrietta, it would be someone else. And someone else might be more ambitious, more clever, and a genuine political rival. Henrietta was safe. She was discreet, politically unambitious, and manageable. So Caroline did something extraordinary. She didn't fight with Henrietta. She co-opted her. She formed a working alliance with her. Queen Caroline and Lady Suffolk became a strange kind of team. Caroline used Henrietta as a back channel to the king. She would give Henrietta messages to pass on to George. She would use her to gauge the king's mood or to subtly influence him on minor matters. It was a way for Caroline to manage her husband without appearing to be the one in control. The court was a bizarre spectacle. Every evening the king would go to the queen's apartments, where he would talk politics and business with Caroline and his chief minister, Robert Walpole. Then, at the appointed hour, he would march off to Henrietta's rooms for his 2 hours of predictable conversation. Everyone knew about the arrangement. It was an open secret, and it worked because Caroline made it work. This was not a friendship. Caroline privately mocked Henrietta's dullness. Henrietta, for her part, was in a difficult position, tied to a king she did not love, and managed by a queen who was far cleverer than her. But it was a stable and effective political arrangement. It prevented the court from being torn apart by factions supporting the queen or the mistress, a common problem in other European courts. The alliance shows Caroline's political genius. She took a situation that should have weakened her and turned it to her advantage. She neutralized her rival by making her an ally. She understood that power was not just about the king's affection, but about controlling the flow of information and influence. By working with Henrietta, she controlled all the avenues to the king. When Henrietta finally retired from court, Caroline was reportedly not pleased. She had lost a useful and predictable part of her political machinery. The story of Caroline and Henrietta is not a heartwarming tale of friendship, but it is a fascinating example of two rival women who chose pragmatism over jealousy. They created a unique and surprisingly stable power structure, a partnership of convenience that kept the British court running smoothly for over a decade. Number 6. Could a deposed queen and an empress find solace in a shared garden? Theodora was one of the most remarkable women of the Byzantine Empire. She began her life as an actress, a profession considered scandalous and lowly. But she captured the heart of the future emperor Justinian. He changed the law so he could marry her. When he became emperor, she became empress, and she was not a passive consort. She was Justinian's co-ruler, his most trusted advisor, and a powerful force in her own right. She was known for her intelligence, her courage, and her ruthlessness. Antonina was the wife of Belisarius, Justinian's greatest general. She was also from a theatrical background, a friend of Theodora's from their early days. Like Theodora, she was intelligent, ambitious, and deeply involved in her husband's career. She traveled with Belisarius on his military campaigns. She acted as his agent and his spy. She was a powerful and often feared figure in her own right. Theodora and Antonina were the two most powerful women in the empire after the empress herself. Wait, that's not right. Theodora was the empress. Let's rephrase. Theodora and Antonina were two of the most powerful women in the empire. They were friends from their youth, but their positions made them rivals. They were both close to the center of power. They competed for influence. Their husbands, Justinian and Belisarius, had a complex relationship marked by both great success and deep suspicion. The empress and the general's wife mirrored this dynamic. They were allies one moment and enemies the next. The historian Procopius, who despised both women, wrote about their plots and schemes against each other. One of their most dramatic points of conflict involved the deposition of a pope. Theodora, who had sympathies for a particular Christian doctrine, wanted to replace the pope in Rome. She used Antonina and Belisarius, whose army was in Italy, to carry out her plan. Antonina was instrumental in deposing Pope Silverius and installing Theodora's chosen candidate, Vigilius. In this, they were powerful allies, working together to shape the religious policy of the empire, but their relationship soured. Theodora grew suspicious of Belisarius's immense popularity and wealth. She feared he might be a threat to her husband's throne. She began to work against him. Antonina, loyal to her husband, found herself in opposition to her old friend, the empress. At one point, Theodora had Antonina publicly humiliated and her property confiscated. The friendship seemed to be over, replaced by bitter enmity. But then, the story takes another strange turn. After a period of disgrace, Belisarius was recalled to favor. And Theodora and Antonina reconciled. It was a political necessity, but perhaps something more. They were two women of a certain age who had known each other their entire lives. They had risen from the lowest rungs of society to the pinnacle of power. They understood each other in a way no one else could. They knew each other's secrets, each other's ambitions, each other's fears. There is an account of them in their later years, spending time together in one of Theodora's private seaside palaces. It describes them walking in the gardens, talking. We can only imagine what they spoke about. Their youth, the men they had controlled and manipulated, the enemies they had defeated, the precariousness of their own power. In that garden, they were not just empress and general's wife. They were two women who had survived in a brutal world. Their relationship was a mix of genuine affection, professional collaboration, and intense rivalry. It was a friendship that was broken and repaired multiple times. It was a testament to the complex bonds that can form between people who are both allies and competitors. They were two of the most formidable women of their time, and their long, tumultuous relationship was as complex and fascinating as the empire they helped to rule. Number 5, why did the Virgin Queen feel a pang of sorrow for her rival's son? Elizabeth I of England, the Virgin Queen, built her entire persona around being married to her country. She had no children. Her heir was a matter of constant political debate and anxiety. Mary, Queen of Scots, her imprisoned cousin and rival, had a son. His name was James. He was the heir to the Scottish throne, and, after his mother, had the strongest claim to the English throne as well. For Elizabeth, James was a symbol of everything she was not. He was the next generation. He was the son of her greatest rival. He represented the future that would come after she was gone. Elizabeth's relationship with James was, from the beginning, a political one. He was a piece on the chessboard of Anglo-Scottish relations. She sent him gifts. She wrote him letters full of motherly advice. She supported the Protestant lords who ruled Scotland in his name and kept him away from his Catholic mother, Mary. She was, in effect, trying to raise her own successor from a distance. She wanted him to be a good Protestant king, an ally to England, and no threat to her own rule. But she also refused to ever officially name him as her heir. To do so, she believed, would be to sign her own death warrant. It would make him a magnet for plots and conspiracies. So she kept him in a state of uncertainty for decades. She was his loving cousin and his patron, but also the woman who kept him from his mother and held his future in her hands. James, for his part, learned to play the game. He wrote fawning letters to Elizabeth. He called her his mother. He assured her of his loyalty to her and to the Protestant faith. He knew his entire future depended on staying in her good graces. It was a relationship built on a foundation of political necessity and mutual suspicion. But was there anything more? A moment of unexpected connection. It came after a moment of profound crisis. When Elizabeth finally signed the death warrant for Mary, Queen of Scots, it put her in a terrible position with James. She had just executed his mother. How could their relationship possibly survive that? James was publicly outraged. He had to be. His subjects expected it. But privately, he did little. He knew he could not afford a war with England. He protested, but he did not act. He chose his future inheritance over revenge for his mother. Elizabeth understood his predicament. And in her letters to him after the execution, you can see a change in tone. There is a new level of intimacy, of shared difficulty. She wrote to him explaining her decision, framing it as a political necessity that had caused her great personal pain. She was trying to console him, but also to justify herself. She was reaching out to him not just as a queen to a king, but as an older, childless woman to the young man who was, for all intents and purposes, her only heir. There are hints that she felt a genuine, if complex, affection for him. She had known him only through letters and reports since he was an infant. She had watched him grow up from afar. She may have felt a kind of maternal pang for the boy whose mother she had been forced to kill. It was a twisted, tragic form of family. Their relationship remained a long-distance dance of diplomacy until the very end. But in those final years, the tension eased. It became clear to everyone that James would succeed her. Their letters became warmer. When Elizabeth was on her deathbed, it was her counselors who sent for James. She never named him publicly, not even at the end, but she had prepared the way for him. The connection between Elizabeth and James was born from the ashes of her rivalry with his mother. It was a relationship defined by absence, by letters, by political calculation. But it was also, perhaps, touched by a strange, almost familial bond. A childless queen and a motherless king finding a way to secure the future of a kingdom. Number 4, did two queens from enemy houses secretly agree to protect their children? The Wars of the Roses was not just one war, but a series of conflicts that spanned decades. Fortunes changed with breathtaking speed. One family who navigated this chaos was the Woodvilles. Elizabeth Woodville became queen by marrying the Yorkist king Edward IV. After Edward's death, his brother, Richard III, seized the throne. He declared Edward's children, including the 2 young princes in the Tower, illegitimate. Elizabeth Woodville and her daughters were forced back into sanctuary. Her world had been destroyed by a rival branch of her own Yorkist family. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, lived the last great hope of the rival House of Lancaster, Margaret Beaufort. And Margaret's entire life had been dedicated to a single goal, putting her son, Henry Tudor, on the throne of England. She was a brilliant political operator, a woman of immense patience and determination. Her son, Henry, was living in exile, a fugitive from the Yorkist kings. Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth Woodville were natural enemies. One was the mother of the Lancastrian claimant, the other was the mother of the deposed Yorkist heirs. But the rise of Richard III changed everything. He was a common enemy. Both women saw him as a usurper. and they both had children whose lives were in danger. Elizabeth's sons were imprisoned by Richard. Margaret's son was being hunted by him. In this moment of shared crisis, these two rival matriarchs did something unthinkable. They formed a secret alliance. The plan was hatched through a go-between, a doctor named Lewis, who served both women. Margaret Beaufort proposed a deal. She would help finance an invasion of England by her son, Henry Tudor. If he succeeded in defeating Richard III, he would marry Elizabeth Woodville's eldest daughter, also named Elizabeth. This marriage would unite the warring houses of Lancaster and York. It would end the Wars of the Roses. It was a political masterstroke. Think about the trust this required. Elizabeth Woodville had to entrust the future of her family to the son of her old Lancastrian enemy. She had to believe that Henry Tudor would honor the agreement, that he wouldn't simply take the throne and cast her and her daughters aside. Margaret Beaufort had to trust that Elizabeth could rally the support of disgruntled Yorkists to support her son's invasion. It was a huge gamble for both of them. But they were both mothers. Their primary motivation was the safety and future of their children. Elizabeth saw this alliance as the only way to save her daughters and avenge her sons. Margaret saw it as the final, brilliant move to win the crown for her own son. Their shared goal of deposing Richard III and securing a future for their children transcended their old rivalry. Their plot worked. Henry Tudor invaded England in 1485. He defeated and killed Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. He was crowned King Henry VII, and, true to the agreement, he married Elizabeth of York. The Tudor dynasty was born. The Wars of the Roses were over. This alliance was not born of friendship, but of mutual desperation and brilliant political calculation. But it is one of the most remarkable examples of two rival women setting aside a generation of hatred to work together. They never met in person during the planning stages. Their alliance was a thing of secret messages and whispered conversations. But it changed the course of English history. Two mothers from opposite sides of a brutal civil war conspired to create a new future for their children and their country. Number 3 was a shared faith enough to bridge the gap between a queen and an abbess. Matilda of Scotland was the wife of King Henry I of England. She was known for her piety, her charity, and her patronage of the church. She was a good and popular queen. Christina of Marquiate was a young Anglo-Saxon noblewoman who felt a powerful calling to a religious life. She pledged herself to celibacy and a life of devotion to God. Her family, however, had other plans. They tried to force her into a marriage. Christina resisted. She fled her home, disguised herself as a man, and went into hiding. She eventually found refuge in a small cell attached to a hermitage. For years, Christina lived as an anchoress, a religious recluse dedicated to prayer and contemplation. Her reputation for holiness grew. People sought her out for her wisdom and her spiritual guidance. One of those people was the queen herself, Matilda. On the surface, they had little in common. One was a queen living at the center of the royal court, surrounded by wealth and power. The other was a humble recluse living in a tiny, bare cell, dedicated to poverty and seclusion. They should have been worlds apart. But they were both deeply religious women, and they formed an unlikely and powerful bond. Queen Matilda became Christina's patron and her friend. She would visit Christina at her hermitage. They would talk for hours. The queen, with all her worldly power, sought spiritual counsel from the humble anchoress. Christina, in her seclusion, offered the queen a space of peace and spiritual reflection, away from the pressures and intrigues of the court. Their friendship was a two-way street. Christina provided Matilda with spiritual strength. Matilda, in turn, used her power and wealth to protect and support Christina. She helped fund the community of nuns that eventually grew up around Christina's hermitage. She defended Christina against those who were suspicious of her unconventional religious life. The queen's patronage gave Christina the legitimacy and the resources she needed to fulfill her spiritual calling. This was not a relationship of rivals in the political sense, but it was a friendship between two women from vastly different spheres of power, the temporal and the spiritual. In a society that was rigidly hierarchical, their friendship defied convention. It was based on mutual respect and a shared faith. The story highlights a different kind of power. Matilda had the power of a queen. She could command armies and shape laws. But she recognized that Christina had a different kind of authority, spiritual authority. She saw in Christina a direct connection to God that she, with all her wealth and status, did not have. And she valued it. Their friendship lasted for many years until Queen Matilda's death. It was a quiet, private relationship, but a deeply significant one. It shows that connections can be formed across the greatest social divides. A queen and a hermit, finding common ground in their shared devotion. It was a friendship that enriched both of their lives, a testament to the power of faith to unite even the most unlikely of souls. Number 2, how did a letter from one queen help another survive a revolution? Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, and Maria Carolina, the Queen of Naples, were sisters. They were the daughters of the powerful Austrian Empress Maria Theresa. They were raised together, but married off to foreign kings as teenagers. Marie Antoinette went to France, Maria Carolina to Naples in Italy. They were meant to be allies, extensions of their mother's political influence, but their personalities and their kingdoms were very different. Marie Antoinette, in the glittering court of Versailles, was initially frivolous and apolitical. Maria Carolina, in the more chaotic court of Naples, quickly became the dominant political force, effectively ruling the kingdom. They wrote to each other constantly. Their letters are a fascinating record of their lives. They complained about their husbands, gossiped about courtiers, and celebrated the births of their children. But as the years went on, their letters took on a more serious tone. The French Revolution began in 1789. Marie Antoinette's world was turned upside down. She went from being the queen of the most powerful nation in Europe to a virtual prisoner of a revolutionary government. Her letters to Maria Carolina became desperate. She described the mobs, the violence, the fear. She pleaded for help from her sister and the other crowned heads of Europe. Well, Maria Carolina was horrified. She was a staunch absolutist monarch. The revolution in France was a direct threat to her own throne and to the entire established order of Europe. She saw what was happening to her sister as a personal and a political nightmare. She became one of the most ardent advocates for a European coalition to crush the French Revolution and rescue the French royal family. Their correspondence during this period is heartbreaking. It is the story of one sister's world collapsing and the other's desperate and ultimately futile attempts to save her. Maria Carolina tried to organize armies. She engaged in complex diplomacy. She sent money and secret messages. She was trying to reach across Europe to pull her sister from the fire. One of the most touching moments came in the form of advice. As the French royal family planned their ill-fated escape attempt, the flight to Varennes, Maria Carolina wrote to Marie Antoinette with practical suggestions. She had experience with the turbulent politics of Italy and offered her sister guidance on how to be more cunning, how to deal with treacherous courtiers, how to play for time. She was trying to teach her sister how to be a ruler, how to survive. The advice came too late. The escape failed. The French royal family was captured and brought back to Paris. The revolution grew more radical. In 1793, Marie Antoinette was tried and executed. When the news reached Naples, Maria Carolina was consumed with grief and rage. Her sister's death turned her into a bitter and relentless enemy of the French Revolution. The relationship between the two sisters was not a rivalry, but a deep bond tested by unimaginable crisis. They were two queens ruling in different countries, brought together by shared blood and a shared threat. Their letters are a testament to the power of sisterhood in the face of political upheaval. Maria Carolina could not save Marie Antoinette's life, but her unwavering support, her constant letters, her desperate efforts to help must have been a source of immense comfort to the doomed queen in her final, terrifying years. It was a friendship that ended in tragedy, but it was a powerful and enduring bond nonetheless. Number 1. Did the world's two most powerful women secretly admire each other? Queen Elizabeth I of England and Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother of France, were the two great female politicians of the late 16th century. For decades, they were the dominant forces in their respective countries. They were rivals. England and France were traditional enemies, and the religious divide between Protestant England and Catholic France only made their relationship more tense. They were constantly engaged in a complex diplomatic game of alliances, espionage, and thinly veiled threats. Elizabeth never married. Catherine was the mother of three kings. Elizabeth's hold on power was based on her own singular authority. Catherine's was based on her ability to control her sons and navigate the treacherous factions of the French court. They were very different rulers with very different styles, but they were also the only two women in Europe playing the game of international politics at the highest level. And because of this, they shared a unique understanding. They saw each other not just as rivals, but as fellow professionals. There was a deep, if wary, respect between them. Their correspondence is a masterclass in diplomacy. It is filled with elaborate compliments and subtle warnings, but beneath the formal language you can sense a real engagement. They were two brilliant minds, testing each other, probing for weaknesses, but also acknowledging each other's skill. One of the longest-running themes in their relationship was the issue of marriage. For years, Catherine de' Medici tried to arrange a marriage between Elizabeth and one of her sons, first Charles IX, then Henry, Duke of Anjou, and finally the youngest, Francis, Duke of Anjou. These marriage negotiations went on for over a decade. They were a central part of Anglo-French diplomacy. Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, probably never had any serious intention of marrying a French Catholic prince. But she used the negotiations brilliantly. She kept France on her side, preventing it from forming a Catholic alliance with Spain against her. She played the game of courtship for political gain, and Catherine, for her part, knew exactly what Elizabeth was doing. But she played along because the negotiations were useful for her as well. They kept the possibility of an English alliance alive and gave her leverage in her own domestic struggles. It was a long, elaborate dance, and in the course of it, the two queens came to know each other very well. They haggled over dowries and religious concessions. They exchanged portraits. They sent special envoys back and forth. They were in a way engaged in the most high-stakes business negotiation in Europe. At one point, during the courtship with Francis, Duke of Anjou, the young prince actually came to England to court Elizabeth in person. She was in her late 40s, he in his early 20s. She nicknamed him her frog. For a moment, it seemed like the marriage might actually happen. Elizabeth was seen to be genuinely fond of him. But in the end, political reality won out. The English people would not accept a Catholic king. The marriage was called off. Throughout this long process, Catherine and Elizabeth were the two principals. Their letters show them working through the details with their male ministers, but the final decisions rested with them. They were two women shaping the destiny of Europe. They may have been rivals, but they were also the only two members of a very exclusive club. They understood the pressures, the loneliness, and the exhilaration of supreme power in a way that no man ever could. Their rivalry was not one of simple hatred. It was complex, sophisticated, and built on a foundation of grudging, and perhaps even secret admiration.